He buried his wife once. Now, the city was digging her up to finish the lie. The orange flag stabbed through her grave looked small from a distance, but to Walter, it was a knife twisting through 7 years of silence. He stood there, frozen, one trembling hand gripping his cane, the other brushing soil from the marble that still bore her name. Redevelopment Zone C. The tag read, red letters against white stone. A bulldozer idled near the fence, its metal arm hanging like a loaded gun waiting for permission. He blinked hard, but the scene didn't change. The world had decided to erase her again, only this time with paperwork and machines instead of whispers and lies. He whispered her name, a sound half lost in the wind. The foreman called out from behind the tape. "Sir, you can't be here. Construction starts Monday." Walter didn't move. His voice came out low, cracked but steady. "She's not part of your road." The man sighed, flipping his clipboard. "Look, old-timer, it's just dirt and stone. Nothing personal." Walter almost laughed. That line, he'd heard it before, when the police wrote her death off as an accidental fall. When her boss shook his hand at the funeral and said, "She worked too hard, Walter." When the doctor avoided his eyes while signing the report. Nothing personal. That phrase had buried more truth than any coffin ever could. He turned away before the foreman saw the wetness in his eyes. The cemetery gate groaned as he pushed through, the sound echoing like a closing chapter. His Buick waited under a gray sky, the same car he'd driven her to the hospital in that last night. Inside, her lavender scarf still hung from the mirror, pale and ghost-like in the dim light. He touched it gently, inhaling the faint trace of her perfume, the only thing time hadn't stolen. Then he opened the glove box. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue, was the envelope he'd promised never to open unless they came for her again. His hands shook as he tore it open. Her handwriting was still neat, graceful, alive. "If this ever happens again, look behind the clock. The truth's not buried. It's waiting." His breath caught. The clock, the old mantelpiece one she loved, the one that stopped ticking at 3:17, the exact minute they said she fell. He closed his fist around the note, eyes burning. The road project wasn't just construction. It was resurrection, not of her, but of the crime that killed her. They'd waited 7 years to finish what they started. By the time he reached home, rain had begun to fall, soft and cold. The house creaked with age, every sound familiar and heavy. He stepped inside without turning on the lights. The clock sat where it always had, brass dulled, its silence thick. He lifted it carefully from the shelf, feeling its weight, the chill of metal against his palms. Behind the frame, taped under the wooden backplate, was a small black key. Next to it, one more note. In the cellar door groaned as he opened it. The smell of dust and paint drifted up, mixed with the faint sweetness of turpentine. Her scent when she worked down there. He hadn't been in this room since the week after she died. His footsteps echoed as he descended, each one slower, heavier. The bulb flickered when he pulled the chain, shadows dancing across the concrete walls. Then he saw it, a small steel safe half hidden behind a shelf of paint cans. He turned the key, hearing the click like a pulse restarting. Inside were photographs, a flash drive, and a red leather notebook. His breath stilled. Her handwriting again, dated months before her death. Council meetings, private payments, threats if I don't back off. Meeks knows. The next line froze him. "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident." The photographs showed men in suits at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The mayor, Councilor Meeks, and a real estate developer he recognized from the local news. In one photo, a man in the background handed Meeks an envelope. Another image captured the same men shaking hands near the site where she'd fallen. His wife had been right. Her death was an accident. It was a cleanup. Walter leaned back against the wall, gripping the notebook like a heartbeat. The silence of the cellar grew heavy, broken only by the faint hum of rain against the window above. He stared at the flash drive. He didn't have a computer, but he knew who did. His granddaughter, Lila. 24, sharp, kind, curious. She worked at the library, digitizing archives for the city. He'd never told her much about her grandmother's death. Maybe it was time she learned. Maybe it was time someone young carried the truth forward. He locked the safe again, pocketing the flash drive and notebook. Upstairs, the house felt different, not haunted, just awake. He set the clock back on the mantel and turned the key. The second hand twitched, then began to tick. The sound filled the room, soft but relentless. 7 years of silence, undone by a single heartbeat of time. He watched it for a moment, tears gathering but not falling. "You hit it well," he whispered. He poured himself a small drink, the kind she never let him have after dinner, and sat by the window. Outside, the bulldozer sat dark against the rain. The city lights shimmered across the wet road. He thought of the men who'd smiled at her funeral, who now signed contracts to pave over her memory. They thought the years had turned him into nothing but an old man with shaking hands. They'd forgotten that patience, when it learns to hurt quietly, becomes the sharpest weapon of all. The clock ticked louder. He reached for his coat, the old brown one she'd patched a dozen times. Tomorrow, he'd see Lila. Tomorrow, he'd let the truth breathe. But tonight, he sat still, watching the second hand move. Every tick a promise, every breath a warning. The house seemed to exhale with him, as though even the walls remembered her voice. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon. He didn't flinch. He just whispered to the ticking clock, "Time's up for them." The rain fell harder, drumming against the glass, drowning out everything but that one steady sound. Tick, 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 like a countdown finally beginning. The flash drive burned like a secret in his pocket as Walter stepped to the library doors the next morning. He hadn't been here since his wife's funeral reception, the day people said polite words, drank free coffee, and forgot she ever existed. The smell of paper and dust hit him, stirring something both familiar and painful. He saw Lila at the far desk, her head bent under the soft glow of a reading lamp, hair tied back, focus sharp. For a moment, he hesitated. She looked so much like her grandmother when she worked. Calm, curious, certain the world was still fixable. He didn't want to break that illusion, but truth had already started moving. "Grandpa," she said, noticing him. He smiled faintly, holding up the small flash drive. "I need your help, sweetheart." She looked at it, puzzled. "What is it?" He lowered his voice. "Something your grandmother left behind." They sat together at a corner table, the screen's glow reflecting in their eyes. The files opened with a click, revealing folders labeled by dates, city meetings, contracts, photographs. One by one, the images came up, officials exchanging envelopes, signatures on property deeds, memos marked confidential. Each line read like a confession dressed in bureaucracy. Lila frowned. "These are bribes," she whispered. Walter nodded slowly. She was gathering proof before they killed her. Lila's breath caught. Killed. He met her eyes, steady and tired. They called a fall. I called what it was, a cleanup. She stared at the screen, processing. "Why didn't you show anyone before?" He looked down, voice low. "Because grief makes you blind, and fear makes you quiet. I thought if I stayed silent, I could keep what little of her they hadn't stolen." They printed the files, stacking them neatly as thunder rolled outside the windows. The old building creaked, like it too remembered something. "Grandpa," Lila said quietly, "if this gets out, people will come after us." Walter smiled, small but real. "Then we make sure it's worth their trip." He slipped the documents into an envelope and wrote on the front in shaky ink, "To the Office of Public Integrity." But before he sealed it, he added another, "To the press." He'd spent years trusting systems that buried truth under paperwork. Now he'd use their own tools against them. "You're shaking," Lila said softly. He looked at his hands, steady enough to write, steady enough to fight. "Just old bones remembering what it's like to stand up," he said. As they left the library, the city hummed around them, cars rushing past, people glued to screens, no one noticing the man holding history under his arm. They drove to an old diner she liked. Rain blurred the windows as they sat in the booth, silent for a while. "She'd be proud of you," Lila said. Walter shook his head. "She'd be angry it took me this long." He looked out at the streetlights reflecting off puddles. "She once told me the truth is like a clock. You can stop it, cover it, even break it, but eventually someone wins it again. He turned back to Lila. Looks like that's our job now. She smiled faintly, and for the first time, he saw the same quiet fire that once lived in her grandmother's eyes. When they got home, Walter went to the attic. Boxes sat stacked and silent, each one labeled in her handwriting. He opened one marked Winter. Inside were old campaign flyers, newspaper clippings, and a photograph of her standing beside a younger councilman, his arm around her, smiling like trust itself. On the back, in her pen, were 3 words. He knows everything. Walter's stomach turned. He remembered Meeks visiting the house a week before her death, saying she needed to let things go. He had smiled that same smile then. The memory hit like a cold wind. He found an old cassette recorder at the bottom of the box, still containing a tape. He pressed play. Her voice came through, calm, almost whispering. If you're hearing this, it means they've finally come for more. Don't let them build their empire over graves. Walter, you always said you weren't a fighter, but I know better. You were just waiting for the right war. He sat frozen as her words filled the room. It wasn't a plea. It was permission, maybe even a command. He reached for the recorder stop button but hesitated, letting the tape hiss for a moment longer, like the sound of her breathing through time. You waited long enough, he murmured. Now it's my turn. He began pulling out files from the boxes, old blueprints, letters, community petitions she'd written, maps of zoning areas, signatures from residents who never knew their land had been sold before they even agreed to it. Piece by piece, her unfinished fight spread across the table. Night crept in quietly. Lila brewed tea, her movements careful, reverent, like they were preparing something sacred. If we send these to the press, she said, they'll try to bury it again. Walter nodded. That's why we don't just send it. We show it. He looked at the photos, the letters, the faces frozen in lies. We go to one place that still remembers her name, the community she fought for. Lila frowned. The Riverside District? He nodded. They tore down her office, but the people there haven't forgotten who stood beside them. They'll listen before anyone else will. He packed the documents into an old leather briefcase she once used. The smell of worn leather mixed with the faint trace of her perfume that somehow lingered after all these years. You really think they'll listen to a couple of nobodies? Lila asked quietly. Walter smiled. They'll listen to her story, and I'll make sure they hear every word. His reflection in the dark window stared back. A man older, harder, yet finally alive. The world had taken his peace, his love, his faith in fairness. What it hadn't taken was time, and he still knew how to use it. When the clock on the mantel struck midnight, Walter fastened the briefcase shut. The ticking filled the silence again, sharp and constant. Lila hugged him, whispering, "Be careful." He held her close, voice low. Careful is how they win. He stepped out into the rain, pulling his coat tight as the wind carried the sound of distant thunder. The city lights flickered across puddles, reflections bending like memories. He looked toward the horizon where the old council building still stood, the place where they called her death an accident. He whispered her name once more, the syllables trembling in the dark. Then he began to walk, slow but steady, each step syncing with the ticking clock inside his head. He reached the corner where the road split, one path home, one toward the district. He didn't hesitate. He turned toward the past. The rain kept falling, washing the pavement clean, but he knew some stains never faded. When he crossed under the streetlight, the briefcase glinted faintly in his hand, like a weapon of truth. And somewhere behind him, in the quiet house he'd left, the clock struck once more, one slow, haunting chime that sounded less like time passing and more like a countdown beginning. The camera flash hit him like lightning, bright and sudden, as the reporters turned toward the old man standing at the front of the hall. Walter had never liked microphones, but today he stood in front of 3 of them, his wrinkled hands gripping the podium like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Behind him, Lila adjusted the projector, her eyes darting nervously between her grandfather and the growing crowd. The press conference had been announced anonymously. No one knew who called it, only that it promised proof of political corruption behind the city redevelopment plan. The mayor's office tried to cancel it, But the story had already spread online. The hall was packed. Walter cleared his throat, his voice thin but steady. 7 years ago, he began, my wife, Eleanor Haines, died in this very building. They said it was an accident. They were wrong. The room stilled. He clicked the first slide. A photograph appeared. The mayor, Councilor Meeks, and 2 developers shaking hands. This photo was taken 3 weeks before her death, Walter said. You'll notice the same men behind the current project, the same land, same signatures, new names. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras lifted. She found out they were falsifying ownership records, he continued. She tried to stop them, and when she refused to sign, she fell down those marble stairs you all walk past every day. He paused, letting the word hang. The stairs didn't kill her. Greed did. Lila switched the slide. A scan of an old letter filled the screen. Eleanor's handwriting, her notes detailing secret meetings, bank transfers, and threats from Meeks himself. The reporters surged forward. The air felt electric. Someone shouted from the back, "How do we know it's real?" Walter lifted a small recorder from his coat pocket and pressed play. Her voice filled the hall, soft and tired but defiant. If this recording is ever heard, it means they've come for more. The truth is written where they can't erase it, under their own signatures. Gasps cut through the air. The reporters leaned in. Lila looked at her grandfather, her lips trembling. He stood tall, eyes on the crowd. She was right. You can hide evidence, but you can't hide the guilt in your own handwriting. A commotion broke near the door. Meeks himself pushed through, red-faced, surrounded by aides. "This is defamation," he barked. "Turn off those cameras." But no one listened. Every journalist's phone was already streaming live. The hall glowed with screens. Walter faced him calmly. "You remember her, don't you?" he said. "The woman you said slipped? The one who begged you to stop stealing from the families who built this city." Meeks tried to smile, but his voice cracked. She was unstable. Everyone knew that. Walter took a slow step forward. "She was brave," he said quietly, "and you killed her with your silence." The crowd erupted with questions, flashes, shouting, chaos blooming from truth finally spoken. While Meeks was dragged out by security, Lila whispered, "We did it." But Walter didn't answer. His eyes were on the clock above the hall's entrance. "Not yet," he murmured. The press would spin. The city would scramble. But he knew power always tried to bury its own crimes. So, hours before the conference, he'd sent copies of every file, recording and photographed to 10 independent journalists, 3 lawyers, and the mayor's biggest political rival. By the time he stood here, the story had already spread beyond any control. The trap was never just this room. It was time itself. Back home, the rain had stopped. The house felt lighter somehow, the air no longer carrying that quiet heaviness of grief. Lila sat at the table, her laptop buzzing with notifications. "It's everywhere," she said softly. "They're calling it the widow's case." Walter leaned back in his chair, staring at the clock on the mantel. It ticked steadily, no longer mocking him with silence. "Your grandmother always said the truth moves slow," he said. "But once it starts, nothing stops it." He sipped his tea, hands still trembling. "Grandpa," Lila said, "they'll come after you. Meeks, the developers, someone will want to shut you up." He smiled faintly. They already tried once. That night, as darkness filled the house, Walter sat by the window watching flashing blue lights pass on the street. The television in the background played the breaking news. Councilman Meeks was under investigation. Police had reopened Eleanor's case, and anonymous whistleblowers had confirmed illegal property transfers. The anchor's voice said the mayor had declined to comment. Walter muted the sound. He didn't need commentary. He'd seen this story play out before, except now. The ending was changing. He reached into his pocket, pulling out her wedding ring, which he'd carried for years without wearing. The metal was cold but comforting. He set it beside the clock, right under the ticking hands. Outside, someone knocked on the door. Lila looked up from the table, startled. "Who would?" she started, but Walter raised a hand. "Let me." He stood, his joints aching but his steps firm. When he opened the door, a man in a gray coat, stood under the porch light, wet and nervous, mid-40s. "Mr. Haines?" he asked. Walter didn't answer. The man looked around before whispering. "I worked with her. Eleanor." I didn't know what they planned that night. I was there when they covered it up." Walter's heartbeat quickened. "Why are you here now?" The man swallowed hard. "Because I saw your broadcast. I can prove everything." Walter studied his face, the guilt written deep in every line. "Then come in," he said. The man stepped inside, dripping rain onto the floor, clutching a folder. Lila watched from the hallway, eyes wide. Walter led the man to the table, gesturing for him to sit. "Start talking," he said. The man opened the folder, revealing signed statements, copies of bank records, and internal memos dated days after Eleanor's death. They said it was cleanup protocol. He said quietly, "Meeks made sure the police never saw this. I was supposed to destroy it, but I couldn't." Walter's eyes scanned the pages, each one a piece of the puzzle finally falling into place. His throat tightened. "Why now?" he asked. The man looked up. "Because you reminded me she was human, and I couldn't carry it anymore." Walter nodded slowly. "You did the right thing," he said. The man's hand shook. "I don't think that matters anymore. They'll come after me next." Walter glanced toward the clock. The second hand swept forward, steady, relentless. "Then they'll have to come through me first," he said quietly. He reached for the phone on the table. "It's time this evidence goes where it belongs." Lila picked up the camera, recording again, her face pale but determined. The man looked at both of them, fear and hope colliding in his eyes. Walter pressed his hand against the folder, feeling the weight of it, of her, of the years, of silence finally breaking. The camera light blinked red, alive. He took a deep breath, voice low but sure. "You can't kill a story that's already been buried once," he said. Then he looked straight into the lens. "Because time always digs it back up." The recording kept rolling as the clock struck once, loud and final, echoing through the quiet house like a fuse catching flame. The sound of footsteps echoed through the marble hallway long before anyone saw him. Walter Haines walked slowly, each step deliberate, the cane tapping like a metronome counting down the last seconds of a lie. The courthouse was brighter than he remembered. Sunlight spilling through high windows, reflections glinting off polished floors. Too clean for the truth it had buried. Reporters whispered, cameras aimed, but he didn't flinch. His old brown coat brushed against his knees, and the silver gray in his hair shimmered under the light. He had come not for revenge, but for truth, and truth, he'd learned, was a quieter weapon. Councilor Meeks stood at the far end of the corridor, surrounded by lawyers and press, his once perfect suit wrinkled, his arrogance replaced by something close to fear. Walter's gaze locked on him, steady as stone. "Mr. Haines, any comment for the record?" A voice called out. Walter didn't answer. His silence was a story now. He reached the courtroom doors, pausing as Lila caught up beside him, carrying the folder that had burned through 7 years of grief. "You don't have to go in there," she whispered. He gave her a faint smile. "I buried her once. I won't let them bury her truth, too." Inside, the room was full. The judge's gavel struck once, echoing like thunder in a stormless sky. Meeks sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly, eyes darting toward Walter. The evidence was spread across screens, the bribes, the falsified signatures, the recording of Eleanor's voice naming him. Walter sat near the front, his back straight, his face unreadable. The Lily drama daylight from tall windows framed the room in harsh honesty. The prosecutor's words were calm but sharp. For years, this man profited from silence. Meeks shifted, jaw tightening, sweat beating at his temple. Walter watched him, not with hatred, but with something colder, recognition. The same man who called his wife unstable now trembled before her words, immortalized in sound. The recording played again. Her voice filled the room, soft, unwavering, full of grace even in warning. Lila reached over and gripped Walter's hand, tears shimmering in her hazel eyes. The jury's faces told the story long before the verdict did. When the gavel struck again, it was over. Guilty. The word hung in the air like a final breath. Reporters rushed toward the doors. Cameras flashed in frantic bursts. Meek slumped in his chair, face pale, fingers trembling. Walter rose slowly, using his cane for balance. He didn't look back. Outside the courthouse, daylight poured over him, unfiltered, unearned by the guilty. Lila caught up, voice shaking. "You did it," she said. He shook his head gently. "No, she did." His blue eyes softened, the first hint of peace in years flickering through them. The wind lifted his coat slightly as he walked down the steps, each movement slow, deliberate, like a man setting down the final piece of a heavy burden. The crowd parted as he passed, silent except for the click of camera shutters, time recording its debt being paid. Later that evening, Walter returned to the cemetery alone. The world felt lighter but quieter, like it too was catching its breath. The sun hung low, painting everything in gold and forgiveness. He stood before Eleanor's gravestone, his cane planted in the earth beside him. The stone gleamed under the sunset. Her photo smiled faintly from its frame, as if the years hadn't touched her. He traced her name with trembling fingers, voice low. They finally listened. The police officer approached behind him, hat in hand, uniform crisp. "Mr. Haines," he said softly, extending a sealed brown envelope. "Official notice. Case closed. Her record's been amended. Cause of death, homicide." Walter nodded slowly, accepting it with a small, tired smile. "Took them long enough," he murmured. The officer looked at him, uncertain whether to speak, then quietly stepped back, leaving him alone with the truth. Walter opened the envelope, pulling out the single-page document, stamped and signed. The paper fluttered in the breeze, sunlight catching the black ink of her name. He folded it carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. His eyes lifted to the horizon, where the sky was bright and unbroken. "You were right," he whispered. "Time does listen." The words drifted upward, caught in the same wind that rustled through the grass and the flowers at her grave. The camera of life seemed to pull back slowly, one man standing between love and justice, between what was lost and what was finally made whole. His reflection shimmered faintly in the polished stone, not as a ghost, but as proof that the living can honor the dead with patience instead of rage. As he turned to leave, Lila waited by the gate, hands tucked into her cardigan, eyes full of quiet admiration. "Grandpa," she called softly, "will you rest now?" He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Resting for the ones who forget. I remember." Together they walked toward the car, the golden light stretching their shadows long across the grass. The ticking of his pocket watch filled the silence between them. Steady and calm, no longer a countdown but a heartbeat of peace. The world around them looked brighter, sharper, like forgiveness itself had shape. Back home, the living room glowed in evening light. The mantel clock ticked again, its hands moving after 7 years of stillness. Walter sat in his chair, setting the folded court document beside Eleanor's photo. He looked at her image for a long time. "It's done," he whispered. The clock ticked louder, each second now a reminder that time had chosen to move again. Outside, the faint chirp of crickets began, the sound of life continuing. Lila entered quietly, placing a cup of tea beside him. "You kept your promise," she said. He smiled, eyes fixed on the mantel. "No," he replied softly. She kept hers. He reached into his pocket, pulling out her wedding ring, the one he'd carried for years, and set it gently beside the ticking clock. The light caught both metal and glass, reflections merging like time folding back on itself. He leaned back, the air around him calm, fulfilled. The clock struck once, then again, a rhythmic echo filling the room. Walter exhaled deeply, peace blooming across his face. The camera would hold on him a moment longer, hands folded, eyes bright, surrounded by soft daylight that felt like memory itself. And as the sound of ticking filled the space, the frame would fade to light, ending not in darkness but in truth reclaimed. Fire, make sure to like this channel, subscribe, and enjoy the videos.